Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. One of the quickest ways to get everyone to hate you at the table is to try and implement homebrew player options that you know are busted, but choose to push for anyways because you claim it's perfect for the character design you had in your head. No website is a bigger offender of bad homebrew than the D&D wiki. While I always allow for my players to bring me homebrew options to consider for my settings, I find that there's usually an official sourcebook that has an archetype that they are looking for that you can tweak the aesthetic of a bit. And if that doesn't work, usually I try to give them a custom item that allows them to do the gimmick they wanted their character to have in a way that doesn't completely disrupt player balance. I don't shut down homebrew because I hate the idea. In fact, over the years, I've allowed plenty of custom feats, weapons, and classes to be added to my games. What I don't want to have happen is someone brings a homebrew option that does so many things well that the rest of the party feels like they aren't needed. If I was playing a co-op game and someone got to have all cheats enabled and the rest of the group had to play the game like normal alongside them, I wouldn't blame anyone for not wanting to play that game for long. Today's treasure goes by the name You Can't Use Muskets in Fantasy, and it's a little bit different here because I don't necessarily agree with the author here 100%, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily his fault alone. He isn't really being malicious here, it's just how the story plays out, as you'll see soon. So this is a story about how me using a musket in D&D apparently made one of the other players angry. The cast is the Dungeon Master, my new friend I met a few weeks ago. I don't know how much of an experienced Dungeon Master he is, but he DM'd a few sessions already. Druid, Fighter, Warlock, and Cleric are players that are not that important for this story, Bob the Elf Ranger, and the problem player me, the Human Gunslinger. Before I start, I have to explain that I used a homebrew class called Gunslinger, with a homebrew backstory that was called Bounty Hunter. I'll put the links of it in the description so you can see it for yourself. We'll talk a little bit about those entries later. We of course try to make it balanced so my characters won't be overpowered. We also made some changes to how muskets work, from the range 40 to 120 feet, which is just a bad joke, to the range of 120 feet to 480 feet. We were thinking about changing the damage since muskets use D12 and most heavy range weapons use D10, but we decided that having a reload mechanic, misfire mechanic, and being loud as heck will compensate for these 2 damage points. We also raised misfire from 2 to 3, so there was a bigger chance for the weapon to break. Dungeon Master also made some lore changes for muskets. In this world, there was no gunpowder. Instead of that, the player was using a crystal powder from magic crystals. Works in a similar way, but instead of lighting it on fire, you had to use some force to make it explode. And instead of making a lot of smoke when you fired, it emitted a quick flash of blue light. Our characters started at level 3, so I already picked a marksman for my class. We also decided that I won't be trying to make or obtain any modern guns, and I will stick with my musket. And the Dungeon Master promised, since my character was very attached to his weapon and won't swap it with anything, he will figure out another way for me to get stronger in fights as the story goes on. So instead of picking up loot like weapons with +1 or +2 bonuses, we will be upgrading my own weapon. Okay, so right off the bat, I don't hate the idea of having a character that's attached to a weapon that they slowly upgrade over time. In fact, doing like these artifact style weapons is one of the best ways to keep players invested in their backstory. You know, if they take their father's greatsword and they bring it on through their journey from a humble adventurer defending a local village to slaying a dragon, it is really cool to like build the legacy of a weapon that future adventurers would loot from like your tomb, for example. But I'm not the biggest fan of putting so much effort front-loaded into this artifact. It's important to keep in mind that if you front-load all these cool mechanics for their class, the rest of the party is going to sit around wondering if you're going to do that for them. And the great part is you totally can, right? You actually can come up with cool new rules for every individual person. It's just a lot of work. So if you make that exception for one person, others might start to expect it, and you can't really blame them for it. I don't know if this is a situation where they homebrewed the homebrew, or if they just really didn't consider the swift reload mechanic when they were balancing how firearms work, but if they start at level 3, he already has this ability that starting at level 2, you ignore the loading property of firearms with which you are proficient, and obviously this gun is the one gun he'll use the entire campaign. It's 100% the gun he's proficient in, so that's something just to keep in mind. One of the reasons they justified having a D12 over the normal D10 was because of stuff like the reload reload mechanic, which as written he already ignores, assuming they didn't tweak it themselves. So I just want to point that out. First session, our story started in a small mountain village. Our party meets at the local inn. We sat down at the table, ate and talked a bit, agreed that we had a common goal of getting to the other side of the mountain, so we should stick together. At the time, a group of bandits suddenly came to the village. They rode into the village on horses and immediately demanded money and food from the farmers and villagers. The innkeeper explained to us that the bandits from time to time came to their and other villages to collect payment for security, and asked us to leave before we get noticed. However, most of our characters were good or lawful, so that was not an option. We decided that I and the ranger would take a position on the roof of the house next to the inn, and the rest of the party would go outside to confront the bandits. A short conversation ensued between the bandits and the party, which gave us time to take a position. We decided to start the fight with a quick shot from the roof as a surprise round. I targeted the bandit who was talking to our fighter, because I suspected he was the leader of this group. Dungeon Master: okay, you two still weren't noticed and have your targets in sight. What do you do? Me: I target the bandit and shoot him with my musket. Bob: you what? Until then, I never used the word gun or musket, so maybe he didn't know what I was using. Me: what? Bob: you can't use that kind of weapon. Me: why? Bob: because this is a fantasy game. There are no muskets in fantasy. Me: what? Of course there are. Bob: no, this is fantasy. DM: there are muskets and firearms. I mentioned that in session 0. Here, a discussion took place which lasted a good 10 to 15 minutes. Me and the Dungeon Master were arguing with Bob, and the rest of them decided to stay neutral. In general, Bob tried to convince us that there should be no firearms in fantasy. He gave Lord of the Rings as an example, saying it is real fantasy, and there are no firearms there. Well, I cited that even at Critical Role, they use firearms. Then Bob said something like, "You are not Critical Role. You are not Matthew Mercer," or something like that. Finally, Cleric joined the conversation, probably already irritated by this, and pointed out that this universe does not use gunpowder but magic crystals. Okay, it's good to know that someone else heard this in session 0. And if magic is so powerful that you can create fireballs and stuff like that, why can't it be used to push a metal ball through a metal tube at high speed? Thank you, Cleric, for that. I hope you're reading this. This basically killed the argument, and moments later we got back into the game. Finally, I shot the bandit. I used 2 grit points, see the link to the class, and rolled 3d12 plus modifiers. I don't remember how much I did, but the Dungeon Master said, "Okay, he's dead. How do you want to kill him?" Me: already? Okay, I take aim and shoot him right in the side of his head. Bob: WTF, what is that damage? Me: I used 2 of my skills to do this. It's not like I will do this every turn. The rest of the fight had gone rather smoothly, but Bob mumbled something under his breath every now and then, mostly when I was dealing more damage than him. From that moment on, his character's behavior changed completely, and suddenly he turned from a friend to my rival. He started to get runny and thought I had stolen his kills every time I killed a low HP enemy. Anyway, we killed all the bandits, got a small reward from the villagers, and went to sleep in the tavern. This is where our first session ended. As far as I know, between sessions, Bob tried to convince the Dungeon Master to remove firearms from his game. He did it on a private call, but my Dungeon Master took the conversation to the group chat so everyone can see it, and said that he won't remove firearms from his game, and if it bothers Bob so much, he can just leave because no one else has this problem. So first of all, I really don't like how Bob handled this situation, just crying over and over again that firearms aren't true medieval fantasy because it doesn't resemble their ideal setting, after being told blatantly by the Dungeon Master in session 0 that firearms will be a thing, is something that I'm never going to support. I also do appreciate that the Dungeon Master shut down Bob's complaining in private very quickly by making it clear to the entire group what his stance was on firearms, and telling him outright, "Hey man, this is my setting, we all agreed upon this, you're the only one that seems to have a problem with it. If you don't like it, you can leave and play a setting where people only do pure Tolkien-esque fantasy." If Bob's gonna whine about something being unfair purely from a stylistic choice, I'm not gonna feel sorry for him. I do think, however, the reason Bob is complaining so much is because he believes this Gunslinger class is OP. And looking at it, starting at level 3, I do agree a lot of the talents are front-loaded. For example, at level 1, you get a +2 on all attack rolls you make with ranged weapons just cuz. And then looking here at the trick shots, there's a lot of powerful things you can do at level 3. Obviously, you're limited to only picking one of these until you hit level 7 where you can grab another one, but the fact that none of these are locked behind levels does mean that someone who's trying to min-max their character can pick the most busted of the trick shots and just pump out the most utility early on. Most classes don't really have a lot going for them at level 3, me. So when you compare it to a class like this, where you can basically have a fully functioning kit as your starting character, I do get some of the frustration. He said he picked the violent shot ability here, which you add an additional weapon damage die per grit. The closest thing that comes to mind is basically a paladin smite, and you have to expend spell slots to smite. By comparison, this Gunslinger gets a ton more grit than paladins do spell slots. You see, as grit, you gain a number of grit points equal to your wisdom modifier, but you regain all expended grit points after a short or long rest. So when you think about it, this class can functionally do an additional 4d12 damage over the course of an encounter and just regain it all by doing a short rest. I feel like at a lot of tables, people take short rests between like every encounter, so that's a lot of damage to have at level 3. If I was Bob, I'm not saying that he handled it well, I'm just saying that I kind of understand why he feels like the musket is the problem. There's a chance that this guy hasn't read what the Gunslinger class does and doesn't understand why the bullets are doing so much damage. I'm trying to be good faith here because I do understand how that could be frustrating, especially if you're a beginner. Alright, let's see what happens in session 2. Session 2 started with Bob sneaking into my room to take my gun. He had high rolls, so I did not wake up. Luckily, there's a rule saying that stealing, breaking, and throwing away other players' stuff is not allowed, so Bob decided to jam my weapon. The Dungeon Master allowed it, but in the last effort to save my gun from this guy, he made him roll to check if he knew how to do it. Bob tried to argue, but the Dungeon Master stated that he had to know how the weapon works to jam it. Luckily, Bob rolled not so good, and the only idea his character got was to stick a rock into a barrel. Bob wanted to re-roll this because we all knew this was stupid, but the Dungeon Master stated that he will be able to try again the next day. So yeah, my character quickly noticed a rock in the barrel and removed it, which made Bob pissed. It was actually the only interesting thing that happens this session, besides him bitching about every single time I killed someone or rolled for a lot of damage. Okay, you see, this time I really don't like how the Dungeon Master handles it. Yeah, you make it seem like it's the luck of the dice this time, but eventually he's gonna roll to jam the gun, and then you end up having to basically discipline them like you should have the first time. But maybe I'm being too harsh on the DM here. Let's see what happens in the final session. Finally, the third and last session came. It went pretty well, and there's not much to talk about for the majority of the session. At the end of the session, our characters were approaching an old fortress in the mountains. It was intended to be an outpost for the bandits because it turned out those bandits from session 1 were part of a much larger group that will for sure seek revenge for their killed friends. We set up a camp on high ground near the fortress and decided to wait until early morning. At night, Bob again tried to jam my gun, but this time he rolled badly enough for my character to wake up. I describe how he grabs his musket and puts it to Bob's character's neck. I also marked him as my target to remove disadvantage from attacking targets in that range. We had a short chat in character. It was basically me telling him not to move and stay the F away from my gun. I was kinda saying it in and out of character because I was a bit sick of this. Bob tried to describe how his character grabbed the barrel of my gun and pushed it away from his neck. I pointed out that I was warning him I will shoot if he moves, and asked the Dungeon Master if I can do it. Dick move, I know, but I just wanted him to stop. The Dungeon Master stated that we will do a dex roll. If Bob wins, he will push my weapon away. However, if I win, I will be able to shoot him as he grabs my gun. I promised Bob that I will use all my points to put the whole 5d12 plus modifier damage into his character's head. I knew that I had a good chance to down him in one shot, since he had something around 35 max hit points. He backed off. The session ended around an hour later with our characters approaching the fortress. This week we will have another session, but I don't really know what Bob is planning, and it's getting kinda boring. I feel like I should ask my Dungeon Master to kick Bob from the game, or at least order him to stop with his anti-firearms behavior. TLDR, the player does not like firearms in fantasy and tries to remove them from the game. After he fails, he tries to mess with my weapon at every opportunity. Honestly, this is a rough story for me. I don't 100% agree with the author here that Bob is in the wrong, at least in the sense that I understand why he's pissed at the musket. The fact that you know that you can down him 100-0 by expending an ability that you'll get in a short rest does kind of prove the point that maybe your character is a little too strong for a level 3 campaign. opinion. I really don't think Bob is handling this situation well, so I don't want to say that he's right as much as you're just also wrong, and I really just wish the Dungeon Master would shut things down. If it means that Bob has to quit, that's totally fine by me, but stop letting Bob roll for stuff that escalates the situation. If there's a rule where you can't sabotage other players, the technicality of, oh, I'm only jamming his best weapon doesn't really make sense. If you had a rogue that was saying, you know, I don't hate the wizard, I'm just gonna burn his spellbook and now he can't cast any spells today, so technically I didn't do anything bad, everyone would call him out on that, so I don't see why the Dungeon Master's letting him do that with the Gunslinger. Yes, the Gunslinger's broken, but that doesn't give him the right to sabotage the musket. He can ask nicely to maybe have a more rebalanced Gunslinger. Obviously there's plenty of versions that exist online that are much more balanced than this. I really do think that Bob's frustration just boils down as he's shooting a bow, he's dealing only so much damage, and then the Gunslinger here can shoot bullets that deal up to 35 damage every short rest with ease. So all in all, I feel like there's 3 people that have a role that they played in here. You might be wondering why I'm also partially blaming the author. I think the author's partially at fault here because he brought something that's clearly busted, and after he's seen how powerful it is, he's almost bragging about it. The author here knows for a fact that his character's busted because he knows that he can one-shot the ranger if he annoys him. If I was a player at a table and I felt like I was so much stronger than my peers, I would intentionally nerf my character so everyone can have fun. Sometimes the person whining while annoying does have a little bit of a point. So as the Gunslinger or as the Dungeon Master, I would hope that someone would willingly offer to make a more balanced version of the Gunslinger. I want to hear everyone's thoughts in the comments below. Do you agree with me, or am I being too harsh on the author here? This is one of those stories where I don't think it's as cut and dry as presented, and that's because I actually got a chance to see the class, and my gut reaction if this was brought to my table would be, yeah, let's not do that. There's better alternatives out there. Let's look at a couple of them. When it comes to firearms in my games, you guys can always play a Gunslinger 100%. Maybe just not the one from D&D Wiki. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe and share the video, as it always helps us grow on the channel. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video. Farewell for now. Hey kid, want to try some Gamersupps? You can now get free samples anywhere in the world and try the most delicious 0-calorie energy powder in the game when you use code LootGoblin. Each sample sent out gets me one step closer to my quest to get a flavor that tastes suspiciously like Dr. Pepper. If you end up liking those free samples and want to purchase some Gamersupps, make sure to use the link in the description or use my code to get 10% off your entire order.